What happens when a woman filled with prejudice believes her actions will go unchallenged? This is the compelling tale of a flight that turned into a battle against intolerance. From an intense in-flight dispute to a dramatic legal aftermath, watch how resilience and justice prevail over bigotry. This gripping story will leave you astonished. The airplane hummed with the steady rhythm of its ventilation system as passengers shuffled in, finding their seats and stowing luggage. Marcus, seated comfortably by the window, slid his laptop bag under the seat ahead of him with precision. His book rested on the tray table, opened to a chapter detailing strategies for scaling businesses. It was a business trip like many others, predictable, efficient, and peaceful. He took a moment to savor the calm before the flight, the kind he often cherished. Then came Karen. She moved down the aisle with a stiffness in her posture, dragging her suitcase in quick, frustrated tugs. Her gaze darted sharply among the row numbers, her demeanor radiating irritation. She exuded an air of entitlement, the kind of person used to having her world perfectly arranged to her liking. When she arrived at her assigned seat, her face twisted into an expression of discontent. Her eyes locked on Marcus, already seated near the window, before darting away just as quickly. Marcus glanced up from his book, meeting her gaze with a polite nod before returning to his reading. Karen's voice broke through the ambient noise, sharp and unyielding. "Excuse me, there must be some mistake," she said, her words tinged with thinly veiled disdain. A nearby flight attendant, quick to assist, approached her. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "I need to change seats," Karen announced, her tone curt as she gestured vaguely toward Marcus without actually looking at him. "This just isn't going to work for me." The attendant glanced at her manifest, then at Karen with professional calm. "Ma'am, this is your assigned seat. Is there an issue I can assist with?" Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "I just don't think this arrangement is suitable for me," she replied, her words carefully chosen, yet laced with unmistakable prejudice. Marcus, sensing the tension but refusing to acknowledge it openly, kept his eyes on his book. He refused to let her words provoke him, though the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. "I'm sorry, but the flight is fully booked," the attendant replied, her tone unwavering. "Please take your seat so we can proceed with takeoff." Karen's expression darkened, but she reluctantly complied, squeezing into the middle seat with exaggerated movements. Her sighs and muttered grumbles were loud enough for Marcus to hear. Words like ridiculous and uncomfortable slipped through her lips, though Marcus remained stoic, determined not to engage. The plane doors sealed with a hiss, and the captain's voice announced their upcoming departure. As the engines roared to life, Marcus prepared himself for what he hoped would be a peaceful flight. But the tension was far from over. As soon as the seatbelt sign dimmed and passengers began to adjust in their seats, Karen resumed her campaign of passive hostility. She exaggerated every motion, shuffling in her seat, dropping her tray table with unnecessary force, and repeatedly brushing against Marcus's arm. Her loud sighs were pointed, her annoyance practically radiating from her. Her muttering grew louder. "Some people just don't have the decency to be considerate," she said, her voice clearly intended to carry to the rows around them. Marcus, placing his book down for the first time since she arrived, turned to her with a calm yet direct tone. "Is there something you'd like to say to me?" he asked, meeting her gaze head-on. Caught off guard, Karen hesitated before responding. "I'm just saying, people should be more aware of how their presence affects others," she said, her tone dripping with condescension as she leaned slightly away from him. Across the aisle, another passenger raised an eyebrow, clearly catching the exchange. Marcus, unfazed, replied steadily, "If you're uncomfortable, that's something you'll need to address within yourself." Karen huffed, her frustration bubbling over. She flagged down the same flight attendant with a dramatic wave. "I need to change seats," she demanded. "I don't feel safe here." The flight attendant approached again, her patience visibly tested. "Ma'am, as I mentioned earlier, the flight is full. I assure you there's no reason for concern. Please remain seated." Karen's indignation swelled. "I'm telling you, I feel threatened. He's invading my space and making me uncomfortable." The attendant remained composed, but nearby passengers began exchanging incredulous looks. The murmurs around them grew louder, a mix of disbelief and disapproval. "Ma'am, this gentleman has done nothing wrong," the attendant replied firmly. "I'll have to ask you to refrain from further comments like these." Karen's voice rose in anger. "So, I just have to sit here and feel unsafe. Is that what you're saying?" Marcus turned to her, his tone unwavering, yet calm. "Exactly what about me sitting here quietly is making you feel unsafe?" Karen's indignation flared. "You're invading my personal space, for one, and frankly, I just don't trust you." At that moment, a voice from 2 rows back interjected, "Lady, he's just sitting there. You're the one making a scene." Karen whipped around, glaring at the source of the comment. "Mind your business," she snapped before turning back to the attendant. "I'm not the problem here. I'm just standing up for myself." The flight attendant, now visibly weary of the back and forth, sighed. "Ma'am, I need you to stay seated and remain calm. If this behavior continues, it may result in further action." The murmurs from surrounding passengers grew louder. A young woman from the row ahead turned to address Karen. "He hasn't done a single thing to you," she said firmly. "You're making this uncomfortable for everyone else." Karen's cheeks flushed red as the tide of public opinion visibly turned against her. The tension in the cabin was palpable. It was clear this confrontation was far from over. Karen's lips parted as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Her cheeks flushed a deeper crimson as she glanced around, realizing the crowd had turned against her. "You don't know what it's like to feel unsafe," she finally blurted, her voice trembling with indignation. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his expression calm but unyielding. "You're right," he said softly, his tone tinged with a hint of irony. "I wouldn't know what it's like to feel unsafe sitting next to someone minding their own business." A ripple of quiet laughter spread through the cabin, followed by murmured agreements. Karen's glare hardened as she crossed her arms, her expression one of defeat masked by defiance. She turned toward the aisle, muttering under her breath, but her voice held no power now. The flight attendant offered Marcus an apologetic smile before stepping away, clearly deciding it was best not to escalate matters any further for the time being. Marcus exhaled and reopened his book, attempting to focus, though his mind raced. He had faced prejudice before, but Karen's relentless hostility felt particularly grating. It wasn't just her words. It was the brazen entitlement with which she wielded them, as though expecting the world to align with her narrow expectations. Minutes ticked by, but the atmosphere in the cabin remained thick with tension. Karen, unable to let the matter rest, began shifting in her seat, her movements deliberate and exaggerated. Her elbow brushed against Marcus repeatedly, and though she refrained from speaking directly to him, her simmering frustration was palpable. Marcus, steadying himself, refused to react, but he knew the confrontation was far from over. At cruising altitude, the plane hummed with its steady rhythm. Marcus stared out the window, letting his gaze drift across the sea of clouds, a serene contrast to the turbulence in row 17. Karen, however, was anything but serene. Her rigid posture and loud sighs betrayed the storm brewing within her. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice cutting through the cabin noise like a sharp blade. "This is just so typical," she said, her tone loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I don't know why they let things like this happen." Marcus turned his head slightly, fixing her with a calm, questioning look. "Things like what?" Karen met his gaze with thinly veiled irritation. "Like forcing people into situations they shouldn't be in. I mean, I paid for this seat expecting a comfortable flight." Marcus closed his book and folded his hands in his lap, his composure unshaken. "Are you uncomfortable because of me?" Karen scoffed, her indignation flaring. "I'm just saying it's not fair to cram people together like this, especially when they don't know who they're sitting next to." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his voice steady but probing. "Strangers? Or someone like me?" Her eyes flicked toward him before quickly darting away. "Don't twist my words. You know what I mean?" "I don't, actually," Marcus replied, his tone even but unrelenting. "Why don't you explain?" Karen hesitated, her lips tightening into a thin line. "People like you have no respect for others' space," she muttered, her words fumbling as she struggled to maintain her stance. It's always something." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his voice calm but pointed. People like me? What exactly does that mean? Karen sighed dramatically, her frustration bubbling over. I don't need to explain myself to you. It's not my fault I don't feel comfortable. A man across the aisle turned to her, his expression a mix of disbelief and annoyance. Lady, he's just sitting there. You're the one making everyone uncomfortable? Karen whipped her head around, glaring at him. Mind your own business, she snapped, before turning back to Marcus. It's not personal. I just don't think it's right to cram people together like this. Marcus leaned back slightly, his calm demeanor unwavering. So, you're saying you're uncomfortable because of me, but it's not personal? Karen bristled, her indignation flaring anew. Look, I don't know what you're used to, but I'm not the kind of person who pretends everything's fine just to be polite. Clearly, Marcus said quietly, his steady gaze fixed on her. Karen's face burned red as she clenched the armrests. You think you're so clever, don't you? Always making everything about race. Her words landed like a slap, drawing gasps from nearby passengers. Marcus stiffened slightly, but his composure remained intact. I didn't bring up race, he said, his voice low and firm. But now that you have, let me ask you, what exactly about me is making you uncomfortable? Karen faltered, her eyes darting toward the aisle where the flight attendant was approaching. I shouldn't have to explain myself to you, she said, her voice faltering. It's just, some people have a way of making others uneasy. Uneasy, Marcus repeated, his voice sharp enough to pierce the cabin's growing chatter. You mean people who don't fit into whatever box you've decided is acceptable? Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. Around them, murmurs of disbelief spread among the passengers. A woman leaned over her seat, her voice carrying across the row. Why don't you stop talking before you embarrass yourself further? Karen turned to glare at her, her venom now scattering aimlessly. This isn't about you, she snapped, before turning back to Marcus. You don't understand what it's like to feel unsafe. The absurdity of the statement prompted a soft, humorless laugh from Marcus. Unsafe? Sitting next to a man reading a book? Do you hear yourself? Karen's hands gripped the armrests tightly as her indignation reached a fever pitch. You're trying to make me the bad guy when I'm just being honest. You've made your feelings clear, Marcus replied, his voice calm but resolute. And I'm being honest when I say your discomfort is your problem, not mine. The flight attendant arrived, her expression serious. Is there a problem here? Karen immediately pointed to Marcus. He's harassing me. The attendant frowned, her gaze shifting to Marcus, who sat silently in his seat. From what I've seen, ma'am, he's done nothing but sit quietly. You're the one causing a disturbance. Karen gasped, her indignation palpable. This is outrageous. I'm just expressing how I feel. The flight attendant straightened, her voice firm. Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice and stop disturbing the passengers around you. This is your final warning. Karen's mouth tightened into a thin line as she leaned back in her seat, muttering under her breath. Marcus exhaled slowly, his patience worn, but his composure intact. Though the confrontation subsided for now, he knew it wasn't over yet. Karen's mouth opened, a furious retort forming, but the words seemed to falter as the younger woman's statement rang through the cabin. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the hum of the plane's engines. The tension in row 17 had reached its peak, and all eyes were now fixed on the unfolding drama. Marcus remained seated, his expression calm yet resolute, his book still resting in his lap as though to signal he had nothing to hide. Karen, on the other hand, stood rigid, her face flushed with indignation, her hands trembling as she gestured wildly. You all have no idea what it's like, she spat, her voice a mix of rage and desperation. I'm the one being harassed here. The younger woman from behind Marcus didn't flinch. She crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. No, she said firmly, her tone calm but cutting. You're the one harassing everyone else, and frankly, we're all sick of it. Karen's face twisted in disbelief. You don't know anything about me, she snapped, pointing an accusatory finger at the woman. I have every right to feel safe on this flight, and if that means speaking up, then so be it. A middle-aged man seated nearby shook his head, his voice loud enough to carry. Feeling safe doesn't mean acting like a maniac and targeting someone who's done absolutely nothing to you. Karen spun toward him, her anger flaring anew. You don't get to judge me, she barked, I'm standing up for what's right, and none of you can see it because you're all too blind." The flight attendant, now standing squarely in front of Karen, spoke with authority. "Ma'am, I've warned you multiple times. You are disrupting the flight and making other passengers uncomfortable. This is your final warning. Sit down immediately." Karen's defiance didn't waver. "I won't sit down until someone does something about him," she shouted, pointing once more at Marcus. "He's the one causing this." Marcus finally spoke, his tone steady but edged with exhaustion. "I've been sitting here quietly the entire flight. The only person making a scene is you." A smattering of agreement rippled through the cabin. "He's right," muttered a passenger from across the aisle. "You're the only one causing trouble." Karen's gaze darted around the cabin, desperation creeping into her expression as she realized she was losing control of the narrative. "You're all against me," she cried, her voice trembling. "This is discrimination. I'm the victim here." The younger woman behind Marcus leaned forward again, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "No, you're not. You're just a bully trying to play the victim when nobody's buying it. Sit down before you embarrass yourself even more." Karen's chest heaved as she took a step back, her hands still shaking. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice low but seething with anger. The flight attendant's voice cut in, firm and final. "Ma'am, you are violating federal regulations by refusing to comply with crew instructions. If you do not sit down immediately, I will have no choice but to escalate this." The weight of the attendant's words seemed to finally register. Karen hesitated, her gaze darting from the flight attendant to the passengers around her, all of whom were watching with a mix of exasperation and disdain. Slowly, and with visible reluctance, she sank back into her seat, her movements stiff and deliberate. The cabin remained silent for a moment, as though everyone was collectively holding their breath. Then, the man across the aisle let out a low whistle. "About time," he muttered, shaking his head. Karen sat with her arms crossed tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her muttering continued, but the fight had drained from her posture. Marcus, still composed, picked up his book and resumed reading, though his focus was elsewhere. The flight attendant lingered for a moment, her gaze sharp, before nodding and stepping away. The tension in row 17 gradually began to dissipate, though the air still felt heavy with the aftermath. Passengers exchanged looks and whispered among themselves, their collective disbelief evident. The younger woman behind Marcus leaned back in her seat, her expression a mix of frustration and satisfaction. Karen sat silently, her gaze fixed on the seat back in front of her, her lips moving in a barely audible mutter. But for the first time since boarding, the balance of power had shifted, and it was clear she no longer had the audience she sought to command. As the hum of the plane settled back into its routine, Marcus exhaled quietly. The storm had passed, but the echoes of its intensity lingered in the air. For now, at least, peace had returned to row 17. Karen's fury reached its peak as she stood trembling, her clenched fists shaking by her sides. Her shrill voice, laced with venom, sliced through the tense atmosphere of the cabin. "This is why people like you shouldn't be allowed to fly with the rest of us," she screamed, her words carrying a vicious weight that silenced the murmurs of disbelief around her. The collective gasp of passengers resonated, the weight of her blatant racism hanging heavy in the air. Marcus remained seated, his posture rigid, but his composure intact. He met her enraged gaze with a calm, steady look, refusing to let her words provoke him. "I've done nothing but sit here and read," he said evenly, his voice carrying enough strength to pierce through the tension. "You're the one creating this issue." Karen's lips curled into a twisted smile of mock disbelief. "Oh, don't play innocent with me," she snapped, her tone dripping with disdain. "You've been sitting there, acting smug, thinking you're better than everyone else. You people always think the rules don't apply to you." The cabin erupted in murmurs of outrage, a wave of collective indignation washing over the passengers. Across the aisle, a man shook his head in disbelief, muttering, "What's wrong with her?" Yet Karen paid no attention to the mounting disapproval. She took another step toward Marcus, jabbing a finger perilously close to his face. "You're nothing but trouble," she spat, her words punctuated by contempt. Every time someone like you shows up, there's a problem. Always demanding respect you haven't earned. Always expecting handouts. Marcus's jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the armrests of his seat. He met her venom with a quiet strength. If anyone here is being disrespectful, it's you, he said firmly. You're out of control, and you're embarrassing yourself. Karen's face twisted with fury. Embarrassing myself? She screeched. You don't belong here. People like you should stick to where you came from. The cabin fell into a stunned silence. The shock of her words left passengers wide-eyed, many shaking their heads in disbelief. A woman 2 rows back muttered under her breath, "Unbelievable!" while another exclaimed, "What the hell is wrong with her?" But Karen ignored the growing outrage around her, her focus remaining solely on Marcus. She leaned closer, her face contorted with rage. You think you can sit there and act like you're better than me? Like you're my equal? You're not. You never will be. Marcus exhaled sharply, his voice low but resolute. Enough, he said, his words slicing through the heated air. You've made it clear what kind of person you are. Now sit down. Karen's defiance flared brighter. She took a step back, her fists trembling as she shouted, "You don't get to tell me what to do! People like you don't belong here!" The cabin erupted in noise as passengers voiced their outrage. A young man recording on his phone called out, "Keep it up. This is going viral." Another voice chimed in, "She's lost it completely." Karen's attention snapped toward the young man filming her. "Turn that off!" she screamed, lunging toward him with an outstretched arm. "You have no right to film me." The young man leaned back in his seat, holding his phone just out of her reach. "I have every right to film this," he replied coolly, "and you're just making it worse for yourself." Before Karen could respond, the flight attendant stepped between them, her voice sharp and commanding. "Ma'am, sit down now. This is your final warning." Karen froze, her eyes darting around the cabin as if searching for an ally. But the passengers around her only stared back, their expressions a mix of disdain and disbelief. "You're all against me," she muttered, her voice trembling with rage. "This is exactly what's wrong with the world. No one listens to the truth anymore." The flight attendant pointed to her seat, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Ma'am, sit down. Now." Karen's body remained tense, her defiance evident. Marcus exhaled deeply, his gaze steady as he looked at her. He didn't want to escalate the situation further, but it was clear she wasn't going to back down. The cabin felt as though it were holding its breath, bracing for the storm that was about to break. Karen's voice rose again, shrill and venomous. "You think you can silence me? I'm standing up for what's right. People like you always cause chaos and think you can get away with it." Her gestures became wilder, her hands flailing as she shouted. Passengers leaned away, some ducking as her movements became more erratic. "Someone needs to stop her," a woman muttered nervously. The flight attendant stepped forward again, her expression firm. "Ma'am, you are out of control. Sit down immediately, or you will face consequences upon landing." Karen's gaze snapped to the flight attendant, and she jabbed a finger toward Marcus. "He's the one who should face consequences. He's been provoking me this whole time." The tension in the cabin was palpable, the weight of Karen's hostility bearing down on everyone. Marcus, still seated, kept his voice calm but firm. "The only thing I've done is exist in this seat. You've been hostile from the moment you boarded." Karen's face contorted with fury. "Don't you dare twist this around!" she shrieked. "I won't let you manipulate the situation." At that moment, the passengers' collective patience snapped. A woman behind Marcus leaned into the aisle, her voice steady and resolute. "Lady, we've all been watching. You're the only one making a scene. Sit down before you embarrass yourself even more." Karen's rage faltered for a split second, but she refused to back down. Instead, she turned back to Marcus, her voice trembling with anger. "This isn't over," she hissed, her fists still clenched, but her words lacked the force they once had, the tide of public opinion now firmly against her. The storm had reached its crescendo, and though Karen's defiance remained, it was clear her control over the narrative was shattered. Karen's fury boiled over as she lunged at Marcus, her hands clawing at his shirt while she screamed, "You don't deserve to be here!" The cabin erupted into chaos. "Hey, stop her!" someone yelled, as Karen grabbed Marcus's arm, attempting to pull him forward. Marcus leaned back defensively, raising his arms to block her. "Get off me!" he demanded, his voice steady but firm. The flight attendant rushed to the scene, her voice sharp and urgent. "Ma'am, stop immediately!" Karen's thrashing intensified, her nails raking across Marcus's arm as she screamed, "You think you can intimidate me? You people are all the same. Nothing but thugs." Two passengers jumped up to intervene. The young man who had been filming stepped forward, grabbing Karen's arm and pulling her back. "That's enough!" he shouted. "You're out of control!" Another man from across the aisle joined him, grabbing Karen's other arm to help restrain her. Karen fought against their hold, screaming incoherently. "Let me go! This is assault! I'm the victim here!" The flight attendant, visibly shaken but resolute, stepped between Karen and Marcus. "Ma'am, you need to stop right now. You're a danger to the passengers and crew." Karen twisted in the men's grasp, her voice rising in a shrill wail. "This is discrimination. I'm being attacked for standing up for myself." "Standing up for yourself?" a woman nearby scoffed. "You just attacked him. You're insane." Karen's eyes darted wildly around the cabin, searching desperately for someone to support her. "You're all against me because I dared to speak the truth," she screamed, her voice trembling with rage. "This is what happens when you let people like him into spaces they don't belong." The murmurs of disbelief among the passengers turned into open condemnation. "Get her off this plane," someone shouted. The flight attendant signaled to a crew member, who returned moments later with zip ties. "We need to restrain her until we land," the attendant said firmly. Karen's struggles grew frantic as the zip ties were applied to her wrists. "You can't do this! This is illegal! You're all going to regret this!" she shrieked. The passengers who had intervened forced Karen back into her seat, her wrists now bound. She glared at Marcus, her voice low and venomous. "You think you've won? You think this is over? You're going to pay for this. You people always do." Marcus shook his head, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "The only person paying for anything here is you." The flight attendant leaned down toward Marcus, her voice apologetic. "Sir, I'm so sorry for what you've endured. We've reported this, and law enforcement will handle her when we land." Marcus nodded, his voice quiet. "Thank you." Karen slumped back into her seat, her muttering continuing under her breath. Passengers around her shook their heads in disgust, exchanging whispers about her behavior. Marcus turned back toward the window, staring out at the endless expanse of clouds. For the moment, the storm inside the cabin had subsided, but the fallout was far from over. The cabin buzzed with nervous energy as passengers whispered and exchanged glances. Though restrained, Karen's rage hadn't diminished. She sat fuming, her face red, her bound wrists trembling against her lap. "You think you're so righteous, don't you?" Karen spat, breaking the fragile silence. "Sitting there, acting like the victim, when you're the one causing all this trouble." Marcus turned his head slowly, his patience stretched thin. "You attacked me, and now you're trying to play the victim?" His voice, though measured, carried an undeniable edge. "You're unbelievable." Karen leaned forward as much as her restraints allowed, her voice rising again. "Don't you dare lecture me. You people think you can walk around demanding respect when you've done nothing to earn it. I've worked hard for everything I have, unlike you." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as passengers shook their heads in disbelief. "Someone shut her up already," a man muttered from the back. Marcus set his book aside and turned to face Karen fully. "I've worked hard for everything I have, too," he said, his voice louder now, commanding attention. "And I'm not going to sit here and let you insult me because you can't handle being called out." Karen's eyes blazed with fury. "Oh, spare me the lecture. You think the world owes you something because of your sob story? Guess what? It doesn't." Marcus's restraint snapped. His voice rose, cutting through the cabin. "The world doesn't owe me anything, but it sure as hell doesn't owe you the right to treat me like I don't belong here. Your entitlement is disgusting." Passengers leaned forward in their seats, captivated by the confrontation. Some murmured their support for Marcus, while others called for the crew to intervene. Karen, undeterred, pushed harder. "Disgusting! That's rich coming from you," she yelled, her voice shrill. You don't even deserve to be on this plane. You're lucky they even let you on board." Marcus's voice matched her intensity. "Let me on board? I paid for this seat, just like everyone else. You're the only one who seems to think you're above the rules." The flight attendant appeared again, her face pale but determined. "That's enough," she shouted, stepping between them. "Both of you need to stop yelling. This is a safety issue now." Karen ignored her, straining against the zip ties as she continued her tirade. "He's the problem. I wouldn't have had to say anything if he hadn't made me feel unsafe. He's been provoking me from the start." Marcus leaned forward, his voice unwavering. "You felt unsafe because I exist. That's on you, not me." The flight attendant raised her hands, her tone firm. "Ma'am, you've left us no choice. We're moving you to the back of the plane until we land." Karen's face contorted in disbelief. "You can't do that. I paid for this seat. You can't just shove me in the back like I'm some kind of criminal." The attendant's voice was resolute. "You attacked another passenger. That makes you a threat to everyone on this flight." Karen sputtered in protest, but the flight crew began moving her, with passengers watching in stunned silence as the situation unfolded. Karen's protests grew louder as she realized what was happening, her voice reaching a fever pitch. "This is a violation of my rights. He's the one who started it," she yelled, her words echoing through the cabin. Passengers jeered from their seats, some shouting, "Get her out of here," while others clapped sarcastically. Two more crew members arrived, their expressions set with determination. They unfastened Karen's seatbelt, carefully lifting her from her seat as she squirmed and shouted. "You're all going to regret this," she screamed, her voice piercing. "I'll have your jobs for this, every single one of you." As the crew guided her toward the back of the plane, her feet dragging along the aisle, passengers erupted into applause. A young woman nearby turned to Marcus and said, "About time they got rid of her." Marcus offered a tight smile but said nothing, his adrenaline still pumping, his hands gripping the armrests tightly. The flight attendant secured Karen in a seat at the rear of the plane. Despite her restraints, Karen's shouting continued. "This isn't over! You'll all see! I'm not the bad guy here," she bellowed, her voice carrying through the cabin. Back in row 17, Marcus took a deep breath, his heart still racing. He turned to the window, searching for solace in the endless stretch of sky. Across the aisle, a man leaned over and said, "You handled that better than I would have. She's completely unhinged." Marcus nodded slightly, but didn't respond. Internally, he replayed the confrontation, the weight of Karen's words heavier than he cared to admit. Anger, humiliation, and exhaustion churned inside him, feelings all too familiar. The cabin settled, but the tension lingered. Passengers whispered among themselves, casting glances toward the back of the plane where Karen's muffled tirades continued. "Is she ever going to shut up?" a man muttered, shaking his head. The plane's descent was smooth, but the atmosphere remained taut. Marcus sat quietly, his hands resting in his lap, as the announcement of the upcoming landing was met with a collective sigh of relief. Near the rear, Karen's voice escalated into bursts of shouting. "This is illegal! You can't treat me like this!" she bellowed, her bound hands twisting against the restraints. "I'll sue every one of you!" Passengers near the back groaned audibly. "Can someone gag her already?" a woman muttered under her breath. Marcus, still hearing Karen faintly from his seat, tuned her out, his shoulders sagging as the adrenaline from the earlier confrontation began to wear off. A flight attendant reassured him quietly, "Security has been alerted. They'll handle everything upon arrival." The plane touched down with a soft thud, prompting a ripple of relief throughout the cabin. Unlike a typical landing, no one moved to unfasten their seatbelts or retrieve their belongings. All eyes were fixed on the rear, waiting for the inevitable resolution. As the plane taxied to the gate, two uniformed security officers boarded swiftly. The cabin fell silent, the officers' authoritative presence filling the narrow aisle as they moved toward the back. Karen's reaction was immediate and explosive. "What are they doing here?" she shrieked, her voice slicing through the quiet. She yanked against her restraints, her movements frantic and erratic. "I didn't do anything wrong. Why are you targeting me?" The lead officer approached her with calm professionalism. "Ma'am, please remain seated and cooperate. You've been reported for causing a disturbance, and assaulting another passenger. Karen's face twisted in disbelief. "This is a joke, right? I'm the victim here," she exclaimed, craning her neck to look toward Marcus. "He provoked me. He started this whole thing." Marcus remained seated, his expression impassive, refusing to engage. A flight attendant stepped forward and addressed the officers. "She's been disruptive since the beginning of the flight and physically attacked another passenger. We restrained her for everyone's safety." Karen's voice grew louder, tinged with desperation. "I'm not the problem. He is. Why are you listening to them? They're lying." The lead officer didn't flinch. "Ma'am, we're going to escort you off the plane. If you resist, additional charges will be filed." Karen's voice cracked as she shouted, "I'm not going anywhere. You can't make me. This is a setup. It's discrimination." Passengers murmured in frustration. "Just get her off already," someone said. "We've had enough." Karen's protests escalated into frantic screams as the officers unfastened her restraints and helped her stand. She thrashed in their grip, her feet skidding against the floor. "Get your hands off me! This is illegal! I'll sue every one of you!" The officers remained professional, their grips firm but measured. "Ma'am, calm down," one said. "We're not going to hurt you, but you need to cooperate." Karen's voice reached a new pitch. "Cooperate with this circus? You're ruining my life for no reason." As the officers began leading her down the aisle, Karen continued to resist. Her shouts echoed through the cabin as passengers leaned away, rolling their eyes or recording on their phones. "I hope you all enjoy ruining an innocent person's life," she screamed. "This isn't over. I'll make sure every one of you pays for this." When Karen passed Marcus's row, she twisted her neck to glare at him, her eyes burning with fury. "This is your fault. You'll regret this. You people always ruin everything." Marcus met her gaze, his expression calm but resolute. He didn't respond, allowing her words to hang in the air, powerless against the truth of her actions. The officers quickly ushered her toward the exit, her protests fading as the cabin erupted into a mix of applause and collective relief. As Karen's tirade faded into the background, the plane seemed to collectively exhale. Relief washed over the passengers, now free from her disruptive presence. A man near Marcus muttered, "Good riddance," shaking his head. That woman was out of her mind. The flight attendant approached Marcus, her voice soft and apologetic. "Sir, we're deeply sorry for what you've endured. Everything has been documented, and security has her in custody now." Marcus nodded, his voice steady but laced with exhaustion. "Thank you." Passengers began gathering their belongings, their murmurs filled with sympathy for Marcus and disdain for Karen. A few stopped to offer him words of encouragement. "You handled that better than most would have," one woman said as she passed, giving him a small nod of respect. Marcus offered a faint smile but said nothing. Though the confrontation was over, the weight of the experience lingered. As the plane emptied, Marcus moved deliberately, retrieving his bag and stepping into the terminal. The tension in his chest was still heavy, but he maintained his composure. He had been asked to remain for a conversation with airport security about the incident. Nearby, Karen stood flanked by two security officers. Though her hands were no longer bound, her voice carried across the terminal, dripping with indignation. "This is an outrage," she bellowed, her words cutting through the terminal's hum. "I've done nothing wrong, and now you're treating me like a criminal. This is harassment." One of the officers, calm but firm, replied, "Ma'am, we've received statements from passengers and crew. Your behavior was unacceptable, and you'll need to remain here for further questioning." Karen's face reddened as her anger boiled over. "Questioning? You should be questioning that man. He started all of this. This is a setup." Her voice grew louder as passengers from the flight stopped to observe. Some discreetly filmed, while others openly shook their heads in disbelief. Marcus sat quietly, his carry-on bag at his feet. He didn't engage, choosing instead to watch the scene unfold from a distance. This wasn't just about the confrontation anymore, it was about accountability. A flight attendant approached him, her demeanor professional but empathetic. "Mr. Harris, thank you for your patience. Security will handle everything from here, and the airline is fully cooperating. If you'd like, we can arrange for a car to take you home." Marcus nodded. "I appreciate that. I just want this to be over." As the attendant walked away, A young woman who had been seated nearby during the incident approached him. Her expression was kind but resolute. "I just wanted to say, you handled that with a lot of grace. That woman was completely out of line." Marcus gave a small nod. "Thanks. I just tried to stay calm." She smiled faintly. "I'm glad people recorded it. She won't be able to twist this in her favor." Across the terminal, Karen's voice rose again. "You'll all regret this," she shouted at the officers. "I'll sue the airline, the crew, everyone. I've never been treated so horribly in my life." A man who had been on the flight chuckled as he passed. "Lady, you did this to yourself," he muttered, shaking his head. Karen whipped around, glaring. "Excuse me? How dare you?" The officer placed a hand on her shoulder. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down." "I am perfectly calm," Karen snapped, her voice trembling with anger. "But this whole thing is a sham. That man provoked me, and now I'm the one being punished. It's ridiculous." A security supervisor approached, clipboard in hand, his tone sharp. "Ma'am, we've reviewed the statements from the crew and passengers. Based on the evidence, you'll be temporarily detained for assault and disruptive behavior. Further legal action will depend on the investigation." Karen's jaw dropped. "Detained? Are you serious? For defending myself?" The supervisor didn't waver. "Assaulting another passenger and causing a disruption isn't self-defense. You'll have an opportunity to explain your side. But for now, you need to cooperate." Karen's voice cracked, her protests growing more frantic. "This is unbelievable! I'm the victim here!" From his seat, Marcus watched quietly, a mix of vindication and exhaustion settling over him. He didn't revel in her downfall, but seeing her held accountable brought a small measure of closure. As the officers led Karen away, her voice echoed through the terminal. "This isn't over. I'll make sure every one of you pays for this." Nearby, a passenger muttered, "She's the only one paying here." Marcus allowed himself a faint smirk. The weight of the ordeal lingered, but he felt a sense of resolution as he picked up his bag and walked toward the exit. Karen's meltdown didn't end at the airport. Within hours, videos of her behavior spread across social media like wildfire, captured from multiple angles by passengers. Hashtags like #NockedPlaneKaren and "Our Airborne Racism" began trending, with clips showing her racist remarks and physical attack on Marcus viewed millions of times. The next morning, Karen woke to chaos. Her phone buzzed relentlessly with missed calls, messages, and notifications. Groggily picking it up, her stomach churned as she saw the headlines, "Woman removed from flight after racist tirade goes viral." The article included video snippets, quotes from passengers condemning her behavior, and a growing list of social media reactions. Karen's face flushed deeper as the officer's words hung in the air. The sterile room seemed to close in around her, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the incriminating images spread before her. Her breathing quickened, but she forced herself to maintain her defiance. "I didn't escalate anything," she said, her voice shaky but firm. "That man provoked me with his attitude. He was smug, condescending. You can't blame me for reacting." The lead officer tapped a finger on one of the photos, his expression unreadable. "This image shows you lunging at him, your hands on his shirt. That's not a reaction. It's an assault." He flipped to another still, her face twisted with fury as passengers restrained her. "And this? The crew's statements are consistent with the videos. You were the aggressor from start to finish." Karen's hands trembled, but she crossed her arms tightly to mask the motion. "You're taking this all out of context. None of you were there. You don't understand what it felt like." Her voice grew louder, almost desperate. "He was making me feel unsafe. He was sitting there, acting smug, like he owned the place, like he thought he was better than everyone else." The second officer raised an eyebrow, her tone flat. "Sitting quietly and reading a book makes you feel unsafe? That's a stretch, ma'am." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line as she leaned forward, trying to seize control of the narrative. "You're twisting my words. He was looking for a reaction, and I'm the one being punished because I refused to stay silent." The lead officer sighed, closing the file and leaning back in his chair. "Ma'am, you're entitled to your perspective, but the evidence against you is overwhelming. You can spin this however you want, but it doesn't change what happened. Multiple witnesses corroborate that you verbally and physically attacked a fellow passenger. That's why you're here. Karen's heart pounded, her mind racing for an argument that could shift the blame. What about my rights? I'm the victim here. He's the one who should be sitting where I am. The second officer shook her head, her tone sharp. The victim? Ma'am? You're here because your actions endangered the safety of everyone on that plane. Not just him, but the entire crew and passengers. You were restrained because you left them no choice. Karen's indignation flared again. But before she could respond, the lead officer interjected. We've presented the facts, and you'll have your day in court. I suggest you use that time to reflect and consult with your lawyer. He gestured toward the door, signaling that the questioning was over. Karen stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You'll see, she hissed, her voice low but trembling with anger. You're all wrong about me. When the truth comes out, you'll regret treating me like this. The officers exchanged a glance but said nothing. One gestured for her to follow, and Karen stormed out, her heels clicking loudly against the cold tiles. Back at her apartment, Karen paced the floor, the weight of the day pressing down on her. Her phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications, news outlets dissecting her every move, strangers flooding her social media with vitriol, and emails piling up from her employer about her suspension. She opened her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she debated another post. She needed to take control of the narrative, to paint herself as the misunderstood victim. But every attempt she'd made so far had backfired spectacularly. Her previous post, an attempt to rally sympathy by accusing others of manipulating the situation, had only added fuel to the fire. The comments were brutal. You attacked a man reading a book. Just stop. This isn't cancel culture. It's consequences. Maybe don't assault someone next time. Karen slammed the laptop shut, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. Her world was collapsing around her, and there was no one left to blame. Her friends had stopped answering her calls, her family had distanced themselves, and even her neighbors avoided her. The word racist spray-painted on her fence had been the final straw. Her once quiet, orderly life was now a public spectacle of shame. Meanwhile, Marcus had chosen silence. On the advice of his lawyer, he refrained from engaging with the media. His focus remained on the civil suit filed against Karen, citing emotional distress, defamation, and assault. The support he received was overwhelming. Strangers sent messages of solidarity, civil rights organizations reached out to offer assistance, and the public rallied behind him as a symbol of resilience in the face of prejudice. Karen, on the other hand, was drowning in legal fees and public scorn. The civil suit threatened to ruin her financially, and her career was all but over. HR's email was clear. Pending the outcome of the investigation, her position was unlikely to be reinstated. Each day brought new headlines and viral posts dissecting her actions on that fateful flight. As Karen sat alone in her darkened living room, her phone buzzed with another notification. This time it was a local news outlet reporting that Marcus had donated part of the settlement funds to organizations supporting diversity and inclusion in aviation. The headline read, "Passenger targeted by in-flight racism turns pain into progress." Karen stared at the screen, the words blurring as tears filled her eyes. She had lost everything: her career, her reputation, her community, all because of her own choices. Deep down, she knew there was no one else to blame. Karen's protests echoed down the courthouse hallway as she was led away, her voice carrying a mix of disbelief and fury. "This isn't fair! I'm not a criminal!" she yelled, twisting against the officer's firm grip. Cameras flashed, capturing every moment of her outburst. Her attorney, trailing behind, wore an expression of quiet frustration, clearly resigned to the unraveling of his client. Marcus, seated on a bench at the back of the courtroom, remained composed, his gaze steady. He had attended the hearing not out of spite, but to see the process unfold with fairness and transparency. Yet, as Karen's voice faded into the distance, A wave of exhaustion washed over him. The events of the past days had taken their toll, and this hearing was just the beginning of a long journey toward accountability. As Marcus stepped into the courthouse hallway, the air was cooler, offering a momentary reprieve from the tension inside. He took a deep breath, grounding himself as he prepared to leave. Just then, a journalist approached cautiously, microphone in hand and cameraman in tow. "Mr. Harris," she began, her voice measured and professional, "do you have a moment to comment on today's proceedings?" Marcus paused, his gaze meeting hers. He hesitated, weighing the gravity of his words before responding. "I have no comment at this time," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for debate. The journalist, undeterred, pressed on. "The public has rallied around you as a symbol of resilience against discrimination. Is there anything you'd like to say to those supporting you?" Marcus exhaled slowly, his posture remaining calm. "I appreciate the support," he said, his voice steady. "But this isn't just about me. It's about accountability. No one should have to endure what happened on that flight, and no one should feel emboldened to act with such hostility." The journalist nodded, her pen scribbling furiously as she thanked him. Marcus offered a polite nod before walking toward the courthouse exit. As he stepped outside, the sunlight was blinding, a stark contrast to the dim interior of the courtroom. Reporters called out his name, their questions blending into a cacophony of noise, but Marcus ignored them, his focus singular. In the days that followed, the public's interest in the case only grew. News outlets dissected every detail of the incident, from the viral videos to the courtroom drama. Karen's face became synonymous with unchecked entitlement, her name trending under hashtags like Jadr Justice for Marcus and Fortune Accountability in Action. Despite the media frenzy, Marcus maintained his silence, choosing to focus on his work and the civil suit being prepared by his legal team. The lawyer had been clear. The criminal case would pave the way for a more substantial civil claim, ensuring Karen's actions would have lasting consequences. Meanwhile, Karen's life continued to unravel. Unable to post the $225,000 bail, she remained in custody, her attempts to garner sympathy falling flat. Her repeated claims of victimhood were met with widespread ridicule, and the court of public opinion was firmly against her. Even her family had distanced themselves, overwhelmed by the magnitude of her actions and the public backlash. 2 weeks later, Marcus once again found himself in the courtroom. This time, the hearing was procedural, with the prosecution presenting additional evidence and the defense scrambling to mitigate the damage. Karen, now visibly worn, sat stiffly at the defendant's table. Her fiery defiance had dulled into a simmering bitterness, though her occasional glares toward Marcus spoke volumes. The prosecutor's argument was clear and concise, bolstered by the damning video evidence and passenger testimonies. Karen's lawyer attempted to frame her actions as a momentary lapse in judgment, citing stress and a lack of criminal history. But the judge, unmoved, scheduled the trial for a later date, ensuring the case would proceed without delay. As the hearing concluded, Marcus felt a small sense of closure. The wheels of justice were turning, slowly but deliberately, and the weight of Karen's actions was finally being addressed. Outside the courthouse, he stood in silence for a moment, the chatter of reporters and onlookers fading into the background. This was far from over, but for the first time since the flight, Marcus felt a glimmer of peace. Marcus paused on the courthouse steps, the din of the reporters and onlookers fading into the background. The crisp air filled his lungs, cooling the tension that had been building inside him for weeks. His thoughts drifted back to the flight, to Karen's piercing words and the unrelenting venom in her gaze. She had tried to reduce him to nothing, to erase his dignity and worth, with a barrage of insults and actions rooted in prejudice. But today, the system had held her accountable. As he stood there, he reflected on the countless others who had faced similar discrimination, many without the support or justice he had received. This victory wasn't just his. It belonged to every person who had been silenced, dismissed, or belittled. Justice, though imperfect, had sent a message. Actions born of hatred would not go unchecked. The reporters' voices grew louder again as they noticed him lingering. "Mr. Harris, can you comment on the sentencing? Do you feel justice was served?" Marcus raised a hand, signaling for quiet. He spoke slowly, deliberately, his voice steady. "Let the verdict speak for itself. What happened today was more than about one flight or one incident. It's about setting a precedent. Accountability matters. I have no further comment." With that, he descended the steps, his lawyer walking beside him. The cameras continued flashing, and reporters followed at a distance, but Marcus kept his focus forward. Each step felt lighter, each breath deeper. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace, not closure, but progress. Karen, on the other hand, sat in the holding cell, her world crumbling around her. The sterile room was quiet, save for the muffled voices of guards in the hallway. Her hands, still trembling, were clasped tightly in her lap. Her mind replayed the judge's words, "Guilty on all charges." The reality of her sentence settled in. 90 days in jail, 200 hours of community service, mandatory anger management, and restitution payments to Marcus. Her protests in the courtroom had fallen on deaf ears, and now she was left to face the consequences alone. Her attorney had made it clear this was the best outcome she could have hoped for, given the overwhelming evidence. Karen's indignation still simmered, but beneath it was fear. Her life had unraveled completely. She had lost her job, her reputation, and now her freedom. The viral videos of her actions had turned her name into a symbol of hatred and entitlement. She scrolled through the news coverage on her phone before it was confiscated, the headlines brutal and unforgiving. Karen's racist rant ends in jail sentence. Flight meltdown sparks national conversation on racism. For Marcus, she had become an example of justice served. For herself, she had become a pariah. As Marcus drove home from the courthouse, the quiet hum of the car was a welcome contrast to the chaos of the day. His lawyer had reminded him that there was still a civil suit to pursue, but for now, he chose to focus on the small victory. Justice had been served in one way, and that was enough for the moment. His thoughts turned toward the future. The experience had left a mark on him, but it also ignited a resolve to use his platform to advocate for change. He had no desire to remain in the spotlight, but if his story could inspire others to stand up against hatred, then it had served a purpose. Pulling into his driveway, Marcus sat for a moment, watching the soft glow of his porch light. The fight wasn't over. Not for him, and not for countless others who faced the same struggles. But today had shown that progress was possible, even if it was slow. Stepping out of the car, Marcus walked toward his home, his steps steady and purposeful. Justice had been served, and though the journey was far from over, he knew he was ready to face whatever came next. Marcus descended the courthouse steps, the chill in the air biting at his face, but he barely noticed. His breath, visible in the cold, mingled with the soft murmur of reporters and onlookers behind him. He exhaled slowly, a steady stream of air that felt heavier than it should have. People like Karen weren't anomalies, and he knew this wouldn't be the last time he encountered such blatant hatred. Her words had stung, not just because of their malice, but because they echoed countless smaller moments of quiet bias he had endured. They were reminders of the times people had avoided his gaze, clutched their belongings tighter, or spoken to him with an air of condescension that needed no explicit justification. Those unspoken judgments, those silent acts of prejudice, had built up over a lifetime, becoming a weight he carried every day. For a moment, Marcus clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he stood still on the steps. The pressure grounded him, tethering him to the reality of the world he navigated, but then he released them, his hands relaxing as he took another deep breath. This time was different. This time, Karen hadn't gotten away with it. Her hatred, once wielded like a weapon against him, had backfired spectacularly. Justice, though slow and imperfect, had done its part. The memory of the passengers who stood up for him warmed him against the cold air. Their voices, their actions, their solidarity, those were the things that gave him hope. The young man who filmed Karen, the woman who called her out, the murmurs of support from strangers across the aisle, each of them had refused to stay silent. Together, they had dismantled Karen's attempt to strip him of his dignity. For that, Marcus allowed himself a small moment of pride. He had stood firm in the face of her venom. He hadn't lashed out, hadn't let her pull him into the darkness where her words had come from. Instead, he had let the truth of the situation speak louder than any insult she could hurl. "Small steps," he murmured under his breath, the words forming a mist that disappeared into the cold. He adjusted his coat, tucking his hands into his pockets as he began walking down the remaining steps. Small steps toward a world where people like her can't so easily weaponize their prejudice. The fight wasn't over. Marcus knew that. It wouldn't be over in his lifetime. But this victory, however small, was a reminder that change was possible. He held his head high as he walked away from the courthouse, the sound of his footsteps on the pavement steady and deliberate. Behind him, the courthouse faded into the background, and with it, the noise of reporters and spectators. Ahead, the path stretched forward, uncertain, but filled with possibility. For now, that was enough.